So one thing a lot of developers fail to realize about generics in Java is that they use type erasure. And type erasure is just a fancy way of basically saying that generics are not real. And what I mean by that is once you compile your Java application, the generics are not in the bytecode. They're not in the code that is run in the JVM. So this is kind of a strange concept to understand here, but what essentially happens is the compiler uses generics. And the compiler uses generics to determine if something's wrong or right. If you can, when we showed the example of adding the wrong type to a house, it would tell you that and give you an error. But once the code is compiled, those generics are stripped out. They're erased, essentially. And everything is essentially an object. We had seen that example of the house earlier in this module where we had not used generics. Well, after you've compiled your code, it basically reverts to that. The bytecode, if you looked at it, would look just like the first example where it was dangerous. The generics made it so that the compiler was able to help us and ensure that we never tried to put the wrong type in our house. But it doesn't need that anymore afterwards. And this is different than a few other languages that have features similar to generics. For example, if you're familiar with C#, C# has true generics. They're not erased at compile time. They actually exist in the bytecode. If you looked at the code that runs in the virtual machine that .NET code runs in, it actually has generics in there. And if you know about C++, in C++, actually code is generated. It's actually a template, is what C++ uses, and code is actually generated that is of that type, or it takes that class and actually generates real code that operates on that type. It's creating new classes for you automatically. So those are real and they exist in that sense. But one of the things to be aware of in Java because of this is that generics are going to behave a little bit differently than what you might expect. You're not going to be able to do a lot of things with generics that you might want to do. For example, if you're in a generic method or a class that's using a generic, you can't check the type of that generic. If you had some generic type T, you couldn't ask, is this type, what is the type? Because it doesn't exist at runtime, so you can't check the type at runtime. Remember, it's going to be of type object always because that type got erased. The same goes for creating a new instance of that type. If you got a type passed in or you had a house of type dog, you couldn't, inside of your class, do a new T or new, which would be new dog, because Java doesn't know about that at runtime, so it's not going to be able to utilize that type. And rather than listing out all the scenarios in which it will cause a problem for you, I think it's better for you to just understand this. So when you're thinking about using generics in Java and whether or not something is legal in Java, just think about what would happen if this code was compiled and the types were changed to object. If you use that as a guideline, then you'll be able to figure out scenarios where you're not going to be able to do something with a generic. For the most part, you're probably not going to run into this very much, but if you're trying to do something fancy with a type inside of a generic method or a generic class, and you're trying to examine what the type is, that's where you're going to run into problems.